This is Julia James Davis, and welcome to The War on Beauty. Recently, two things happened that I think are interestingly related. The 80th anniversary of the nuclear bombing of Japan and a viral Twitter or X discussion of Picasso's famous Guernica painting. These two events, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II and the painting of Guernica by Picasso, are two of the most important historical events that systematically changed the world, not just politically and psychologically and socially, but aesthetically and culturally, leading to a systematic erasure of beauty that I call the war on beauty. Basically, it's that there's so little beauty in our world, from our films, our art, our architecture, our music, where there used to be so much beauty in the past, specifically before the World Wars. But first, let me give a little bit of context here. World War II began in 1939 and ended in 1945, which was the year that the United States dropped the first and only nuclear bombs that have ever been dropped in the world to date, which was an action that was both credited for ending the war, but was also seen as an unjust and unnecessary act because it killed so many innocent civilians. And then the subject matter of Picasso's Guernica, which was painted somewhat recently, a little bit before World War II, depicts Guernica's bombing, a town in the Basque region of Spain, by the Nazis during the Spanish Civil War, who were allied with Francisco Franco. This was 2 years before World War II started. And this event, the bombing of Guernica, was also seen as an unjust act of war. And it's one of the very early examples of carpet bombing, which was a tactic heavily used in World War II. So some people have even called this a dress rehearsal for World War II. These two events are important for different reasons as it relates to the war on beauty, which is what we're going to talk about in this video, which is firstly the permanent psychological damage and state of fear that the introduction of nuclear warfare caused in the world, and secondly, the cementing of art as an exercise in the external representation of that psychological damage, political chaos, and fear. So we can look back at hundreds of years of art in the Western world and see that it's all basically been beautiful, from the monumental cathedrals of the 13th century to the Renaissance and the Counter-Reformation, up until the 19th century with Romanticism and Impressionism. Art through time and through practically every movement and every century, both secular and religious, was beautiful. It strove to create something pleasing to viewers, and even in treatments of difficult or disturbing scenes like a Rubens war painting, artists generally aimed to transfigure that disturbing content into something of beauty. But everything changed starting in World War I, almost as if the entire purpose of art had just been flipped on its head. Everything aesthetically really turned on a dime almost. And that is because hope turned into jadedness, depth turned into flatness, humanity turned into machine, and poetry turned into prose, to reference Dietrich von Hildebrand, who I think I've referenced in every video since I've read his book Aesthetics, which I highly recommend. But basically, the function of art for hundreds of years up until World War I was beauty, creating things of beauty that people enjoyed. So every art movement in and around World War I, from Cubism to Dadaism and Neue Saccholite and Surrealism, signaled a major shift of art towards reflecting back to the viewer the chaos and disorder of the times. And that makes sense because these times were really horrific. These were events, World War I and World War II, that changed everything. World War I was the first truly modern war with a casualty rate higher than any previous conflict by far due to technological advancements made in war. So instead of man versus man fighting, World War I was man versus machine. And because it was a total war, the boundaries between civilian and soldier were effectively erased. In World War I alone, it's estimated that 15 to 20 million people died, with about 7 million of those being civilian deaths. And it's important to keep in mind that this was only a war that lasted 4 years. So the scope and scale and tragedy of this destruction was absolutely catastrophic beyond belief. World War I was really the major catalyst for pushing art in this new direction that we now see today, with the sealing occurring during and after World War II. So how this relates to the atomic bomb, I was watching a very interesting speech from Bishop Fulton Sheen on YouTube called Youth and Sex, where he talks about the lack of morals in society, that now we steal and there's a lot of crime in cities and we just can't be carefree anymore. We can't leave our doors unlocked and let our children play in the yard. It's just too dangerous. He says that we live in a different world than we did in the past. And he says that we can actually pinpoint a specific date where the world changed. 8:15 in the morning, the 6th of August, 1945, the dropping of the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima. It was this moment, this event, that erased, he said, all boundaries and limits.
When we flew an American plane over this Japanese city and dropped the atomic bomb on it, we blotted out boundaries. There was no longer a boundary between the civilian and the military, between the helper and the helped, between the wounded and the nurse and the doctor, between the living and the dead. We broke down boundaries and limits. And from that time on, the world has said, we want no one limiting me. So that you people heard the song, you've sung it yourselves, I gotta be me, I gotta be free. You want no restraint, no boundaries, no limits. I have to do what I want to do.
Which then led to the erasure of discipline and obedience and the increasing objectification of others as a means to an end. But also, he said, it is by discipline, it's by boundaries, and as well as loving each other genuinely that we are truly happy people. And I think going further, because of this event, there was an introduction of this sort of feeling that nothing seems to mean anything anymore. We started to live life as if it were nothing, that we could act how we wanted, slap up ugly buildings that were just gonna fall down in a few decades because who knew if the world was even going to be around tomorrow. Faith and religion, family, tradition, and virtue were in steep decline. And to mirror that, churches, homes, schools, government buildings, art, everything stopped being beautiful. And either that's because of this lack of hope that took over, or because we live in a new world now, and the old, more simple, earnest, and poetic one was killed. I think that it's not either or, I think that it's both and. Plus, from that moment on, we lived with the constant threat of nuclear war hanging over us, which is really not conducive to building or creating for future generations. So how this relates to the Guernica painting. People recently on Twitter were really debating this painting painting, if it was a good painting or not, and if Picasso was a good artist or not. But I think it's interesting that all these years later, Guernica is still a very important work in art history for a lot of reasons. Firstly, this painting is monumental. It's truly more of a mural. I think that better describes it than a painting, and it's become synonymous with anti-war protest art. And Picasso himself was certainly a revolutionary artist aesthetically. He was undeniably, I think, a genius. Whether you like him or not, he was a master painter, especially if you go back to his very early works. And it's estimated that he produced about 50,000 works of art in his lifetime, an absolutely massive body of work. Not only that, but he famously constantly reinvented himself throughout his career with all of his different periods. But this painting is really unsettling. It's huge and it's very jarring. The imagery is very disturbing. And I think that that is the point of the painting. Picasso wanted to show, I believe, the reality of this new total warfare tactic that targeted civilians in civilian towns, or at least happened to involve them, because again, as Bishop Fulton Sheen said, this was the beginning of the breakdown of boundaries. And so Guernica is not beautiful, and I think that that is not the intention. But the important point of this work, at least as it relates to this video, is that it sets a precedent for art. Not only that aesthetics shifted from the beautiful to the ugly in a visual representation of the chaos of the world, but art became a vehicle for personal political statements by artists. And yes, art has always been political in the sense of leaders or countries producing art and buildings as a means of branding themselves. Like, for example, King Louis XIV with the Baroque style, or even more similar to the scenario of Guernica, Jacques-Louis David. He made works that were overt political symbols. But what makes those previous political expressions of art different is that either it's not done by an artist to personally reflect their political views, or if it is, like David, the message is conveyed through allegory, while also still striving for beauty. So in sum, as boundaries were erased and communal bonds were dissolved, and as life appeared a lot less hopeful and the individual became the center of their own worlds, while at the same time governments gained more and more power over us, this all changed our arts and aesthetics and culture and society profoundly. And this change is all perfectly summed up in the Guernica painting. And the reason, again, for that shift is an increase of fear and hopelessness, and I believe a decrease in love and faith. The British politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, who similarly lived during a time of great change during the American and French revolutions and the Enlightenment, he theorized that beauty creates feelings of love in us. He says, by beauty, I mean that quality or those qualities in bodies by which they cause love or some similar passion to it. And by love, he means that satisfaction which arises to the mind upon contemplating anything beautiful of whatsoever nature it may be from desire or lust. Since the world wars, there has been such a loss of love in the world. Think about declining marriage rates, declining birth rates, declining religiousness, and basically the decline of everything good with an equal and opposite increase in negative things. Anxiety, depression, and suicide. All these things are tangible indicators of how people are feeling and doing and thinking. For example, to get married is an outward signal, symbol, and indication of love. And so if marriage is declining, we can also then infer that maybe there's less love. Maybe people are entering relationships less. And from statistics, we know that that's the case. And then babies, which are generated from the love of a man and a woman in marriage, also signal not just the generation of love in a marriage, but also hope and wanting to have a stake in the future. But those very important and fundamental things in society are not happening anymore. And just the same as people are less inspired to procreate and bring new life into a very messed up world, neither are we building beautiful buildings or creating beautiful works of art for posterity that will outlast us. Our architectural and artistic output reflects this perceived impermanence and lack of meaning in life and lack of love, and it's serving only to reflect back to us our contemporary entropy, which then from there is just this self-fulfilling cycle that's a constant spiral down. Because again, as things become more ugly, more chaotic, then we ourselves feel more and more that way, and then we create more and more of those ugly and chaotic things. Almost all of our contemporary art is intentionally shocking, ugly, and absurd. As much as we are living really in a post-war world, a post-World War world, we are also living in a post-beauty world. And I do understand that just as Picasso saw the images coming out of Guernica, we see the endless suffering all over the world, and even in a more vivid and affecting way, because we are constantly bombarded with the news of just horror after horror on our phones, especially as war has really increased since the World Wars. In fact, we have been in an almost constant state of war since then, especially in the West. But to merely reaffirm this state of affairs through art is really, I think, taking the completely wrong action if we actually cared about affecting real change. In fact, it might not seem very intuitive, but the answer to all of this is beauty. Because both this contemporary existential dread and the ugliness of art relate back to a singular core problem. Again, fear and faithlessness. What we should do is instead transfigure these feelings into beauty, into an attempt to bring more love into the world, if beauty does inspire feelings of love. Otherwise, our society is surely going to collapse, and I actually think that it already has collapsed. And now it's really on us to save it. As Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world. But I think that that actually could just be rephrased to love will save the world. Love comes from a world with boundaries, of faith in God, and hope in the future, of loving others, not just for what they can do for us, but just for the sake of loving them. And only in this way can we truly bring back healing and hope to our culture, specifically our Western culture, that has become so devoid of meaning and of beauty and of love. The way that we do this, again, I always say it, but it's through God. It is through God, because He is the source of all of these good things. And it's only by reliance and faith on Him that we ourselves can even hope to have those qualities in ourselves and attempt, hopefully, to share them with others. So those are just a few thoughts. I actually think this topic is extremely deep. All of these social issues that occurred post-war and really leading up to the war. So many other aspects of this topic as to why our world changed so much aesthetically after World War II. But this is just, I think, one small aspect of it, and I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think that World War II is the moment that everything changed? That beauty really had a hard out, I think, after World War II. So I would love to know your thoughts about this in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. I hope that you will please like, comment, and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future videos from the War on Beauty, and I will see you in the next video.